Well, thanks so
Right.
much for coming on, Amanda.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so I'll let you get straight into it and start off with introducing yourself. You've been working in-house a long time and now as your own consultant. Yeah.
Sure. So yeah, like you said, Georgia, I have been in SEO since 2013. Most recently, the last 3 years, up until recently at Optus. And then I have been doing independent consulting, but I've worked with enterprise companies in various different forms, both at agencies when I was earlier in my career, and also just generally throughout my career. I've done consulting and worked with enterprise and medium to large size businesses. And as I'm sure we're all aware, there are some very particular concerns when you work with enterprise SEO. And let's see, will it let me? Yep, okay. Just quickly wanted to acknowledge just traditional custodians. And for enterprise, I think for me, the hardest thing is it's not about scale, but mindset and politics, because you're a cog in a much bigger machine. And that's even more so if you're an agency, because you're the lowest man on the totem pole. You're someone that is essentially a whipping boy, right? And there's also the flip side of it in that small changes will have small to no results for enterprise SEO and for enterprise companies. So if you choose to die on the hill of whether or not you can change title tags, you're probably not going to get very much done. And it's difficult because people feel like you might be questioning their authority or putting their job in danger. And very rarely then are things a simple ask or kind of a low-hanging fruit. And just for a bit of a story time, one of the first recommendations that I made when I was at Optus was to move to server-side rendering, because of all of the three major telcos in Australia, so of Telstra, Vodafone, and Optus, Optus was the only one that relied heavily on JavaScript and didn't have some sort of dynamic rendering solution. And it would improve our site speed and it would improve our visibility. But there were so many other elements that were affecting why we couldn't do server-side rendering. Like, there was really disparate and siloed management of our server resources. We would effectively have to rebuild our Gatsby library, and that would have been literal years and millions of dollars. Our development team was primarily React, which would have involved training up in Gatsby and then all of that. And then the cost benefit equation as well was quite thin, because it actually costs quite a lot more money to execute on the server rather than client side. And we've been trying to do a proof of concept for about 18 months. So all of these things, if you don't necessarily have that context into the client or into enterprise, if you just kind of have that recommendation, oh, we should do server-side rendering because it'll do these things, can come across as a bit um, uneducated or uninformed about the larger business structure and how that impacts resources, right? Because SEO isn't just you doing something, it's everyone. So we actually decided to address site speed in different ways and kind of navigate around and have server-side rendering and client-side rendering rather just be a kind of known that we would be dealing with. So, and then the other side of it was, if we wanted to change anything on the page, if it was a component that already existed, it was all right, but it had to be very, very specific. If it was something that didn't exist yet, it was very unlikely that it would be able to be implemented, because we had no AEM, Adobe Experience Manager developers. So there's a lot of context in terms of the wider business with enterprise, more so than a lot of small to mid businesses. And Georgia, I'm not sure what format you prefer, but I'm happy for people to jump in with questions at any point as we go through. So feel free to raise a hand or, take a bit of a gap and ask questions or what have you. One of the biggest things that I would recommend when you start with a big company, right, is understand what their processes are, and in particular their financial processes, because if you need to be, so we started our financial planning for the new financial year, for example, halfway through. So we started our financial planning for the next financial year about 6 to 8 months before the new financial year. So sometimes those are conversations that you need to be having a lot sooner. And plus, knowing all of the people to talk to is fantastic. And getting stakeholder buy-in is essentially stalking. Really, it's social engineering at its best, and hopefully not its worst, because it's really about getting to understand the person and what matters to them. And even when you have a conversation that you start, it's never really actually about you. And generally, you all know me, so this is something that makes me a little bit sad sometimes, but sarcasm and humor very rarely land the way that you want them to in emails or text messages or any kind of asynchronous communication, because people are reading it with their own mental context and their mood for the day, how they woke up, if they've had enough coffee. They're not reading it like they would hear it if you were speaking. So try and actually actively avoid sarcasm in your emails unless you know someone really well and you want to speak to their level. And this is something that I have mixed feelings about, but sometimes the best way to build a relationship is to ask for a small favor from that other person, because it starts kind of creating that feeling of reciprocal trust. And there are a lot of different ways to get to know enterprise and people in enterprise, but a lot of it is following them on available channels. So whether that's public socials, you want to lean into the banter at the beginning, ask questions, and rather than making statements, and be curious, really get to know their team. If they have a personal assistant, get to know them, find out what their favorite, treat at the end of a terrible day is. Don't be above bribes. In terms of in-house processes, you want to learn things like how they report on value internally, if their legal team or their brand team have cheat sheets or any kind of approval teams. Because sometimes it's not legal or brand, but sometimes it's risk or compliance. Sometimes there are different layers of approvals that you need to get through. And if any of them have the ability to say, these are the things outright that we will say no to, and these are the kinds of ways that you can write something and we'll be okay with it, that will make everyone's life easier. Basically, stakeholder management is finding all of the ways to make that person, whether it's your immediate stakeholder and your immediate main point of contact or whoever's doing the work, to make their life easier and then to make them look good to their bosses. So it's really about finding out as much as you can about those things and however you can make their lives easier. And a lot of that is about understanding how we as humans work. So that's looking at empathy and leadership and, introversion or extroversion, as well as behavioral psychology and behavioral economics. It leans much more on the side of, if you're talking about specific kind of channels and areas of learning, it leans more into user experience and conversion rate optimization than it does kind of traditionally into SEO, but it is really good to get a grasp of in terms of those communications with folks that are at enterprise or large companies. And I mean, this is where the kind of behavioral psychology comes in, right? Because one of the biggest principles that applies in behavioral psychology to decision making can be what's called post-purchase rationalization, which basically means that we've made a decision emotionally, right? And then we justify it rationally. So that may mean when you have these conversations initially with people, you're looking at, how do I build a story? How do I talk about what they care about and position this in relation to their direct competitor that I always hear them talk about? Or how do I position it in terms of the customer and tell that story and get them to think emotionally? Um, and then a really easy way to continue to build trust is do what you just said you do by the time you said you do it. And if you don't think that it's possible, communicate that as early as you can. It's a level of transparency and just the ability to acknowledge and keep deadlines that sometimes it's more just kind of the principle of the thing, right? It may be that you tell someone that you can have something done by Friday and it's not something that is urgent, right? But then you deprioritize it and it doesn't get to the client until, Wednesday or Friday the next week without any communication. That's not the best look, right? So we want to continue to build that trust. And talking to their level is another way of doing that, right? You don't want to punch down and use that industry jargon to confuse and obscure the way that you're talking about things. So choose a metaphor, whether that's going to the doctor, going to the gym, moving house, or whatever it may be, and really lean into it and use it to explain as much as you can. My favorite metaphor is I describe Google's crawler as a toddler on a sugar high, right? That if you don't put anything its way and just let it roam and do whatever it will, it's going to find everything that it wants to find and everything that's relevant to it. But if you put something in its way, it will fall down, have a tantrum, and run away, hide in a corner, go cry. So things that are kind of immediately relatable like that. Everyone has seen a toddler on a sugar high at some point or another, most recently probably on the Christmas holidays. So find those common touch points, those human ways to describe something that could be really new or really obscure or very unclear or kind of just mired in craziness. And one of the other ways to really continue to build that trust, right, is any time that you have with that client, with that stakeholder, treat it like it's the only time that you're going to have for that month, because it may be, because most enterprise level companies have meetings 5-6 hours a day is just meetings, which is unfortunate, but the reality of the situation. So you want to be really concise, you want to respect their time, you want to be organized, know what you're talking about and how it will benefit them, as well as kind of getting that sense of what you think they'll ask you and have answers to those ready, as well as actually listening and being curious about what they're saying, because they may not be the expert in SEO, but they are the expert in that portion of the business. So they may have a different perspective that will help you make a better decision either now or in the future. And one of the really easy ways to get buy-in and build magnitude and build impact at an enterprise level is proof of concepts, because I mean, it's a very low stakes ask, right? It's not, can we spend $2 million to create an entirely new resource library for you know, all of our home and garden products, right? It is, hey, can I take 2 weeks of your content writer and developer's time to create this little project that we'll be able to see how it does, and from there be able to give you a guess about how well or how poorly this idea could work for us. We've seen our competitors do it, and we think it could really be useful for our customers or for our potential customers, but we're not sure yet. And it's definitely a humbling experience, right? Because particularly with enterprise, it's really important to remember you're not necessarily there to decide on the solution, right? You're there to clearly articulate the problem and what a good solution should look like. And from a technical perspective, if you have particular issues, it's looking at the patterns and finding that scale. And something to remember with most websites of a certain size, right, is that your primary point of contact, they aren't going to have direct ownership or direct control over the entire website. It's going to likely be broken up by portfolio or by product offering. So if your enterprise client, say, has 4 major product offerings, so 4 major sections of their website, likely those are owned by different people. And so anything that you want to do on those other directories of the website, you're going to have to work with your point of contact to understand the impact and scope out the project and help convince the other stakeholders to get that buy-in and get that done and how it will impact them. So it's a whole process as well. So if you know that already and you know what the business lines are, it makes your life a bit easier, because then you understand how to really leverage that for your benefit. And with technical issues generally, assume it'll be difficult to get access to crawl logs. You want to develop a hypothesis. And one thing that a lot of traditional management consulting agencies do, like Deloitte, KPMG, one of their really strong processes that they do internally is they get what they call a pre-yes. Basically, any idea that they float past someone to get approval for is an idea that they've heard already at some point, that they have been a part of the consideration and the creation of. So it would be one of those kind of casual emails or phone calls where it's like, hey, what would doing a what would doing a redesign of the website look like? How long would that take? Could we just do it on a small portion? And like getting the person involved. Again, that's another little bit of behavioral psychology, right? That's called the IKEA effect. When you are in the process of building the thing yourself, you actually get more invested in it. So plus nobody likes surprises. So getting those pre-yeses from developers or stakeholders or other team members can really help change some of that shock and some of that sticker shock sometimes when you give recommendations, just kind of what may seem like out of the blue. And you want to actually approach things like your content and your technical recommendations with a business integrated approach. So make sure that you have visibility across who their primary audiences are. You want to make sure that it's organized properly. Know what you actually have from a content perspective. If you're working specifically on content, like find those random blog articles from 2012 that no one has touched in a decade, but are still showing up in search results, but maybe haven't been touched in a decade. And generally try and keep it as evergreen as you can and as valuable and useful. Just keep doing that. And remembering that every search in Google is trying to answer a question and figuring out the context of that question for your client's specific needs or jobs to be done or customers. You know, in terms of just some examples for you to kind of consider, right? Because someone may be looking for a new phone, right? But they could be looking for a new phone because they broke theirs, or they could be looking for a new phone because they've just started a new business and need something that can work for both their personal life and their work life. So understanding those different nuances and making sure that you're across those, again, really helps build trust. And there's really no one way to work at scale. For me, it was about time, proof of concepts, and Screaming Frog. But for other people, it's learning Python, it's SQL, it's AI and ChatGPT. But that's not how I went through it. And if you're looking for Python, Hamlet is a great place to start. And just generally being curious and humble. And you can get results like this in terms of a 30% incremental increase in organic revenue when you focus on the niche rather than the broad, or looking at industry case studies and statistics to pull in to help add to that authority and that perception of authority that you may be looking to kind of traverse through, because building trust with SEO can be difficult. And competitor research around the Wayback Machine, historical clients in your own industry, getting everything you can to help build a case actually based on data and the real world rather than just theory. And really having as ironclad of a case as you can for getting proof of concepts and for getting buy-in and approval. Now, some takeaways: generally, it's really never about you. You want to learn as much as you can about the business and make no assumptions. Remove any jargon and speak in the business's language, and then proof of concepts might be your BFF. But I ran through that very quickly. So feel free to pepper me with questions because I would love to answer them. I'm sure there's a lot that we didn't cover here or that you have questions on for me. I will mute.
Thanks, Amanda. I have a question.
Absolutely.
Have you faced the situation where, like, in-house, you haven't had the ability to actually change or influence the content on the site, but then it's on a subdomain or something like that? Or it could be like a similar situation. And how did you kind of go about then kind of pitching for it to get moved to a better place, basically?
Sorry, I realized I asked someone to unmute rather than unmuting myself, so I apologize. No, that is a good question. Generally, I approached it similarly to a proof of concept, right? I would say, because, so for example, a lot of enterprise companies like Optus and others will have something very similar to a blog, right? And in my experience and in my recommendations, that isn't the best place to have content anymore necessarily, in terms of hosting it. So I basically said, okay, I didn't worry about the content hosted in other locations, right? I said, okay, as an experiment, let's publish some of the things that we had intended to publish over here on this subdomain or the subdirectory or whatever over here instead, and let's see how it does. And then you can kind of hopefully have that positive case study where you can look at the performance and say, okay, in the first month after publishing this content, it's performed in organic traffic or revenue or whatever metric is most valuable to the client. It's performed 10 times, 20 times, 30 times, even if it's just like 5, 10, 15% better. You have a grounding in reality to say, here is this thing. How about we move all of this historical content to here? And then you have justification at that point.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like basically like having the test case or starting from the quick wins and then building up.
Yeah. Starting from the easy ask to prove the bigger ask. Yeah, essentially.
What are some other easy asks that you've had success with in the past?
Like I said, with Enterprise, there are very few things that are actually easy asks, unfortunately. And I will unfortunately give the very stereotypical SEO answer of it depends. It depends on how your website is managed and how your business is structured, right? So for me, because I was in-house, I got to know a lot of people and a lot of different functions. And so sometimes it would just kind of be me like buying someone a coffee and asking, hey, how do I do this? Or, hey, can I get access to this? A lot of it honestly was me doing the thing myself because that was the quickest way to get it done, or talking to the product owners or the developers that I was friendly with and just be like, hey, could you do me a really big favor and just like slip this into your backlog? So that's part of the reason why for agencies in particular at working with enterprise level clients, I really suggest getting to know as many people as you can. So sometimes that may be doing basically having an open company training for SEO, right? Having an SEO 101 or having an SEO training specifically for the content team or specifically for the developers, just getting your face in front of as many people as you can so that you can leverage those weak connections and just kind of ask people questions, be curious, see if there's an easier or a quicker or a sneakier way to get something done that they may be able to kind of fly under the radar with, in terms of not having to go through 5.5 million levels of approvals or backlog grooming or whatever it may be. So yeah, it's definitely about the people side of it. At least it has been for me historically.
Good advice. Let anyone else ask their questions.
I got a question, Amanda. What type of software were you using in your enterprise roles in the past? And do you think that the software that you were using really made a difference to the business? Or do you think it's more about actually being a person and getting in there and getting stuff done? I know there's a lot of tools on the market that say they're like the silver lining bullet for enterprise and they're going to do a lot of things, but do you think that's the case, or do you think it's more a case of like you need to be in the business actively getting stuff done, meeting people for coffees, working things out? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, sounds like I know what your thoughts are, and I tend to agree. I think once you get to a certain maturity level in your SEO career, the foundations are always going to be the foundations. And for a lot of enterprise level companies, because there's so much kind of technical debt and so many fractured systems and old systems a lot of the times, a lot of those foundations have kind of started to crumble a bit. So any experience that you have kind of beyond those first 3 or 4 years, you already kind of know what you need to do, right? Most of the time, enterprise level websites aren't actually that complex in terms of what their issues are. It's kind of a matter of scale. So in terms of the tools that we used, my old manager and I had a similar perspective to you, where it was, okay, let's just strip out a lot of the fluff and get the information as quickly as we can, because that is one thing that you find in enterprise generally, is that you're quite time poor. So we used Dragon Metrics for rank tracking, and then we used a combination of different crawlers for visibility. Initially, it was Deep Crawl, then we moved to Screaming Frog and Sitebulb, but it was honestly, that was kind of more what we had access to on our personal machines, because the corporate laptops at Optus were quite shut down in terms of installing software onto them yourself. And as we were leaving, as I was leaving, we were onboarding Botify, which something like that I do think could be beneficial, because it would allow you to gather URLs and be able to kind of group issues in the background without you having to do it manually. So I think it's a bit of a mix. If you can find a non-enterprise solution that still does that kind of aggregate analysis and kind of grouping without you having to, have a 2 terabyte hard drive or something ridiculous in order to manage that capacity, then I think it would be beneficial, but I don't think it's necessarily required. Does that answer your question, James?
Yeah. I mean, it does. I mean, like, I guess there's benefits of all tools, and I guess, yeah, with the enterprise level laptops, they do seem pretty locked down from our experience, where we've had team members working in house and things like that. You can't really install a lot, so yeah, you have to do a lot of things on the agency's computers or your personal computer. So yeah, that's a good shout. But yeah, interesting. I mean, in other enterprise level companies, what's your thoughts on link acquisition? Do you feel like some enterprise companies do not need link acquisition because sheer size of the site, or do you feel like digital PR and building out content assets can yield results, especially if they're launching like a new cluster? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, that's kind of a
Yeah.
multi-question.
So I can tell you at Optus, I didn't do any active link building or link acquisition at Optus, partially because our legal team was very conservative in terms of allowing us to work with influencers or get links or things like that. So it was a bit kind of shut down from that perspective. Plus, Optus was a company that was getting so much press kind of naturally and getting those links naturally that it wasn't our primary issue, right? There were a lot more opportunities for improvement with our tech stack and with just the way that our website was built and the content that we had on our website than our backlink profile. So our actual website and working on that would give us more impact. In terms of launching a new portfolio, yeah, the way that I would approach it would probably be less to do it myself and more to work directly or as closely with the company's PR team, whether that was internal or external, as I could. So give them guidelines, give them that SEO training and tell them like, look, there is a context to digital PR and things that you need to keep in mind. And like, we need to get links to product pages or the product categories and not just the homepage and not just the About Us page or the ethics page or whatever it may be. Like, you need to get deep links, and this is why, and do that education piece rather than necessarily doing it ourselves. It, for me, a lot of times in enterprise companies, it was about folding it into the natural operations of the company as much as I could, so it would become other people's second nature to do SEO or to consider SEO. So that's kind of how I approach it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think like if the business is at a certain level of maturity, they probably don't need links. You're right. There's probably other more high priority things where they're going to get quicker wins, you know, like large scale technical changes and things like that, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
So agree 100%.
Do you have a
Just
question,
to
Matt?
jump off there, yeah, just staying on links
Yeah.
for enterprise, how do you go about, if at all, communicating the value of link building? Say a client, it's like we're spending 10K a month on links. How can you show us how this is helping our business? Is it as simple as just showing them an increase in rankings to the targets of pages that you're building links, or how do you go about that?
Yeah, so I think one of the slides that I had in here was about where you can kind of, and what you should be trying to learn about the company, right? And one of the biggest, I think, undervalued areas with enterprise companies is the finance teams, right? All the people that are crunching numbers that are super nerds, like a lot of SEOs, but just for numbers rather than the internet. I would talk to the finance team and potentially the PR team as well, and see how they calculate the value of the coverage that they get, right? Because PR is an embedded process. It's something that, you know, every enterprise company under the sun has PR and a PR team, and that's something that they understand. So if, you know, the cost acquisition, say, of a particular piece of coverage in, I don't know, the AFR or something, if that is valued in terms of the cost of the agency and the value of the coverage, or even the reach, right? So a lot of times CPM in terms of the reach for a newspaper or an article, like that is, you buy that. They have that media number somewhere in terms of like, yes, cost per million or cost per thousand is, you know, $2,000, right? You can reverse engineer that and use that for your valuing your link building as well to a certain extent, right? You can say, okay, the cost of an average piece of coverage with X amount of reach or whatever is $10,000. For us, we get X kind of coverage for 200. So I think that's an interesting place to start because you're speaking a language that's already familiar to the team.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Yeah. This is when I feel like I should play the Jeopardy soundtrack.
I have a follow-on question from that.
Yeah.
Like for like any example where like you might need to show the value of SEO, like through dollar signs. Have you ever been asked like confidence levels and like, or how you would go about that?
Yeah. So one of the exercises I had to do essentially quarterly at Optus was traffic forecasting. And that was an exercise that we always did. And I knew if I had to translate that into revenue, you know, I had the average conversion value and then translated that into the average profit, essentially. So the model that I used wasn't based on keyword impacts. Like there are a couple of different ways to approach SEO forecasting, right? You can do, I am at position 5 for X keywords, and this is what could happen if we get to position 2. The way that I approached it was much more just based on historical traffic trends and building a forecasting model off of that. And then putting in what our own impact, we thought our own impacts could be in terms of market, or, you know, if we knew that Samsung was going to be releasing a new phone line that they had never released before, and we estimated it would have 20% more impact than whatever. So, and that we usually based off of internal business numbers that already existed. So I never necessarily gave confidence levels, but I did have to give forecasts and be able to justify those forecasts. And that was, we did that usually because we came to an agreement with the other departments internally about, this is the impact that we think this initiative will have, and this is why.
Yeah, it makes sense.
And if you want, and adding confidence intervals is, once you have a number, it's usually pretty straightforward to add confidence intervals. But yeah, that's how we did it.
Have you found like a more like authoritative guess like bench guide for, like, you know, like the top 10 positions, which is then like a guide I think is the best, that reflects how many clicks go through to each position?
One of the things that I try and do is create a custom click-through model, because what the industry statistics, the industry benchmarks, what are the, now that like position 2 actually gets the most clicks now? I don't know, I could be entirely misled, but what is it generally that position 1 gets like 33% of the clicks?
Yeah.
But because there are so many rich results now and so many different enhancements, if you can pull out Google Search Console data and just create your own click-through rate model, that would be ideal. It would just take a lot of time potentially, because to get through the throttling, you might have to use the API or run it daily or something like that. So
Interesting. Yeah, definitely something to test.
yeah, for sure. Darcy, you have any questions for me? No, just kidding. I won't put anyone on the spot.
All right. Does anyone have any final questions for?
So what was the most enjoyable part of the enterprise SEO?
I think interestingly, I think for me, it was the level of trust that I had, honestly, and the level of flexibility, because I worked within an agile team, and I think I encountered more people than I ever had that were excited to learn about SEO and genuinely interested, which was a new experience for me. So I would say, yeah, I would say that personally.
Cool.
Well, if that's it, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for having me on.